Test, test. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could get everyone to take your seats, please. First off, I'd like to welcome everyone for coming out. This is a fantastic turnout, great evening, and we are very proud to welcome Chris Fonvielle to come share some stories about Cape Fear and some recent findings and different things here at Cape Fear. Many of you have already met Chris, but I'll tell you a little bit about him. He's a native Wilmingtonian with a lifelong interest in the American Civil War, Cape Fear history. He attended our public schools, including New Hanover High School, class of 1971. He was the first soccer-style place kicker in North Carolina football history. After receiving his BA in anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, he served as the last curator of the Blockade Runners of the American Confederacy Museum. He subsequently received his MA in American History at East Carolina and a PhD from the University of South Carolina. So that makes Chris a wildcat, a seahawk, a pirate, and a gamecock. Chris and I have known each other a long time, and during our project on the initial early stages, I stumbled across something that I thought was a buried golf ball, and later found out it was something quite a bit more interesting. So called Chris up, and he's been fantastic to come out and spend his time doing a lot of very dirty work below the surface. And we have a lot of artifacts, some of which are on display. He'll get into many of the others, and we got many more that are currently with the curator, and hopefully will be back soon to us very soon. Without that, I want to introduce Chris Fonvielle. Thank you.
I spoke to Joey a week ago, and he said, we've got 55 people signed up. When I walked in the door, he said, there are 175 reservations. We should have charged $10 a piece. We'd both be rich. Neither one of us are getting anything but a good time out of this. It's so great to be back at Cape Fear Country Club. My grandfather was a member. My father was president here in the 1960s. I grew up playing golf at Cape Fear Country Club. I grew up in Beaumont on West Renova Circle, so I could walk with my clubs from Beaumont over to Cape Fear and play golf. And I just have such very fond memories of Cape Fear Country Club. And there used to be a golf tournament named after my father, who died as a very young man, the Gene Fonvielle Memorial Golf Tournament, but I don't think that's played anymore, is it? I don't think anybody knows who Gene Fonvielle is anymore. There's so many new people in Wilmington, but I'm proud to be a native Wilmingtonian along with my good friend Jay Talbert, who I've known since childhood, since kindergarten. In fact, he and I played on the very same football team, where I was the first soccer-style place kicker in North Carolina football history. And Bill Calder, is Bill here somewhere? Bill was my holder. Wait a minute, that didn't sound right. He held the ball that I kicked. So we go way back, and it's just a lot of fun to be here with y'all tonight. And look, I would much rather carry on a conversation than a lecture. So if at any time during the proceedings you have something to ask or something to add, please stop me, raise your hand, and we'll be glad to talk about it then. Now, as glad as I am to be here with y'all tonight, I should not be here. 2 months ago, when Joey said, look, let's have a meeting, a public gathering to talk about the discoveries that we made. How does January 16th sound? That sounds good. January 16th is my wedding anniversary. I know it's a guy thing, but carry around a calendar with you guys and make sure that you don't book a session to talk about cannonballs and mini balls when you're supposed to be out wooing your wife of 38 years. My wife Nancy is here with me over here tonight. God bless her for putting up with me for 38 years, but God bless her for putting up with me to talk about cannonballs and mini balls with y'all tonight when I should be out taking her to a nice dinner and so forth. So anyway, okay, History on the Green. How clever a title is that? Just came up with that tonight. The Cape Fear Country Club, of course, you know, history's everywhere. It's underfoot, it's underwater. Did you know that we've got the largest assemblage of Civil War shipwrecks anywhere in the world? We have more than 30 blockade runner wrecks along the Cape Fear coast. That's the largest collection of Civil War shipwrecks anywhere in the world, and I guess in any parallel universe. But of course, history's underfoot no matter where you go. And I remember my grandfather told me many years ago that when the course built here, of course, you know, the first one was at Hilton Park, started in 1896, and they moved out here in the teens. I think 1913 is when they first started to play golf out here. And he told me that when they built what we know was the 7th green, that it collapsed. And underneath it was a bunker that turned out to be a Civil War bunker. And I just always remembered that story. And then when I grew up playing golf here, I remember walking from the 8th tee down the fairway and along the earthworks that we all know about, of course. I found a mini ball just sitting on top of the ground. And it just occurred to me that, you know, there was Civil War activity right here where we're all playing golf. In fact, if we could walk out the back of this building, you would see a Confederate artillery battery called Dalton Battery or Battery Dawson, which was named for the Civil War mayor of Wilmington, John Dawson, Dawson Street. So that's Dalton Battery, and there it is there. Can everyone see okay? I know it's difficult for those of you in the back. And then from Dalton Battery going westward, and we'll get into more details in just a little while, there's a line of earthworks between the 1st fairway and the 9th fairway that connected Dalton Battery with the 7th green, which was Battery McCree. And about this time last year, this strange guy from Cape Fear Country Club called me up. And you know, he has played every golf course where there has been a major championship in the world. In the world. That's unbelievable. And that's like saying, I'm not kidding. I mean, that's like saying there's the largest assemblage of Civil War shipwrecks anywhere in the world right here at the Cape Fear coast. That's an incredible accomplishment, and he's still going. Well, Joey called me up and he said, Chris, we're renovating the course to go back to the original Donald Ross links design. And we were doing some work up on the 7th green, and I found a ball, an iron ball that I think might be Civil War. Would you come out and take a look at it? And so I did, and it turned out to be a 2-inch iron ball like this. And I said, sure enough, that's a Civil War grape shot or a canister ball. And he said, well, we also found a World War I helmet. The helmet turned out to be a bedpan. Well, we've been wearing this helmet. So that's not my problem. But in the days before there was trash pickup, people just buried their trash in the backyard, and the backhoe operator operating in that area had dug up an old trash pit, and this bedpan was in the trash. But that was the most interesting artifact, and then he asked me, well, would you be willing to come out and do some excavations? And absolutely. I mean, this is my ballywick here. This is what I absolutely love to do. So I came out and spent the better part of 2 months in March and April digging the 7th green, and I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. But I want to provide a little context to the history of Cape Fear Country Club's Civil War history. So go back to April 1861, right after the Battle of Fort Sumter, which was the first battle of the Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln declared economic warfare against the seceded states because we were a region of farmers, planters, and slaves, and we did not have the factories to manufacture the stuff that was needed to fight a war. So the South was going to depend on the European marketplace to bring in military supplies and civilian goods. And President Lincoln, knowing that, declared a naval blockade of the southern states, which would be from the Cape Henry in Virginia to the Florida Keys to the Rio Grande River. That was about 3,600 miles of coastline and about 12 dozen major seaports. And this was going to take a long time to implement, much less make effective, when most Americans thought the war would be over in 90 days, maybe one big battle. And the war turned out to be 4 years and cost more American lives than all other American wars combined. The numbers keep growing. It's about 750,000 now, and we don't even know the civilian deaths. So the blockade took a long time to make effective. And what they did is they concentrated their efforts at the major southern seaports, like Norfolk and New Bern and Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah, Pensacola, Florida, New Orleans, Mobile. I'm not going to name all 12 of them, but you know. And the response, the southern response to the blockade was to use or employ ships, Confederate commerce vessels, that would smuggle supplies into the southern seaports on board ships known as blockade runners because they were attempting to pierce or run through the blockade. And by war's end, the U.S. Navy Department could account for 1,600 blockade runners, about 300 of which were steam vessels, which were employed by late 1863-64 because of their speed and their stealth. Before that, when the blockade was ineffective, you could use a bark or a schooner or a corn cracker to break through the blockade. But eventually, the investors, the speculators, the shippers, the importers, the exporters depended on speed and stealth, not unlike the drug trade today. So these ships brought in much needed supplies like rifle muskets and artillery and bayonets, ammunition, gunpowder, blankets, medicines, and of course civilian goods too, because no war effort is successful without popular support. We all understand that. So that people, even during wartime, could still go out and buy their smartphones and their iPhones and their Androids and their smart TVs and so forth. So they could still buy their hoop skirts and their kid gloves and fine wines and liqueurs and so forth. And this was a very potentially lucrative trade, but also a very dangerous trade, because if your ship got caught by the Union blockading vessels, then the cargoes were confiscated, the ships were confiscated, the ships were turned into Union blockading cruisers to chase down speedy blockade runners. It was a cat and mouse game. And slowly but surely, Wilmington became the main port of entry for these blockade running ships. As Union forces captured New Orleans, they sealed Savannah, Georgia to the blockade running trade. They put Charleston under siege by the spring of 1863. So Wilmington, they recaptured Charleston in 1862, not Charleston, but Norfolk. So Wilmington more and more and more became important to the blockade running trade. And Wilmington, believe it or not, in 1860 was the state's largest city. There were 10,000 people who lived here. I passed 10,000 people on my way from Greenville Sound to the club tonight, It took me 30 minutes to get there from Greenville South. I mean, I still drive around thinking I can be anywhere I want to be in 15 minutes. That Wilmington is gone. So there were 10,000 people who lived here, and it was the busiest seaport, which it is today, as you know. And by 1863, it was the South's most important seaport for the blockade runners that brought in these vital supplies. And it was just perfectly situated for the blockade running trade. Most of the trading partners with the Confederacy were European nations. Austria, Prussia, Spain, France, Belgium, but particularly Great Britain. And the common practice was that supplies would be put on large ocean-going merchant vessels and sent from, say, Liverpool to neutral transshipment points, which were open ports that also traded with the North, like Halifax, Nova Scotia, and St. George's, Bermuda, and Nassau, Bahamas, and Havana, Cuba. And Wilmington, close to the Virginia battlefront, and particularly by the spring of 1862, when Union Army and Navy forces recaptured Norfolk, and then captured and occupied 2/3 of the coastal plain of North Carolina from the Virginia line all the way down to White Oak River, only 60 miles north of Wilmington. So they occupied all of that. But instead of going after Wilmington, which they should have done, they hopscotched over Wilmington and went after Charleston instead, because that's where the war had started. That was the nest of secession, and public and political interest centered on Charleston. And that worked out well for Wilmington and the blockade runners that operated at Wilmington. They just transferred their operations to Wilmington. And Wilmington slowly but surely became the most important seaport in the South. And geography played a big role in its importance, because at that time there were two entryways, two inlets into the harbor. You had Old Inlet, the main channel then and today, and then 6 miles as the crow flies to the north-northeast was New Inlet, which was carved by a hurricane in 1761, something we know a little bit about. Florence sat on top of us 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, for 3 days. The 1761 storm sat on top of the Cape Fear for 4 days. And it literally created a new inlet. And Cape Fearians, being very creative with the name for inlets, called it the New Inlet to differentiate it from the Old Inlet. But now there are two entryways into the harbor, but what that meant was that sand was displaced by the waves of the ocean from east to west. So that over the next 100 years, it started to shoal the river. It built up Bald Head Island at the mouth of the river, but it also made it very difficult for ships going up and down the Cape Fear River, because they had to deal with very shallow areas. So in the 1850s, the Corps of Engineers said, you know what, New Inlet really should be closed. And then you let the natural forces clear out the channel, the main channel, so that ships can go up and down the Cape Fear River. And this is long before the days where you had readily available steam dredges like the Corps of Engineers does today to keep the channels clear. You depended largely on natural forces and jetties and so forth. And, but that didn't happen until after the Civil War. And of course, now we all know that New Inlet was closed by the Rocks, which was the most ambitious Corps of Engineers project ever undertaken, when they closed an inlet that was 1.25 miles in width. And they took big giant wooden cribs and they filled them with quarried rock, and they sunk them in the inlet, and they built up a pyramid-shaped breakwater, and they capped it with cement. And they closed New Inlet, but that wasn't completed until 1884. And now today you can go to the end of 421, end of New Hanover County, and you can walk across what we call the Rocks. And by the way, did y'all know that the designer and supervisor of that project was Henry Bacon, who's buried in Oakdale Cemetery? His son, Henry Bacon Jr., was a teenage employee on his father's construction project. And in the 1920s used similar construction techniques, wooden cribs filled with quarried stone, sunk them along the bank of the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., so that he could put what monument that he designed and built? The Lincoln Memorial. So there's that connection between Wilmington and Abraham Lincoln. And there are a lot more connections that I could talk about if I had more time. Both of them are buried in Oakdale Cemetery. Okay, so geography played a big role in the success of blockade runners at Wilmington, where the success rate was about 80%. 80%. Where if a blockade running ship made a run from, say, Bermuda to Wilmington, investors stood to make about a 90% profit on that run. How did Rhett Butler make his fortune in Gone with the Wind? As a blockade runner, right? And then he got Scarlett O'Hara, and then he did give a damn. Before I retired, I used to mention Rhett Butler and Gone with the Wind to my students. They had no idea. Time to go. Time to retire. Okay. So these kinds of steamships, this was actually North Carolina's blockade runners called the Advance. These ships would bring in vital supplies. They would load up with cotton, which was the main southern export, run out to Bermuda or Nassau, and then that cotton would be sent to Europe. And cotton that sold in the South for 8 to 10 cents a pound could sell in Europe for 50 cents to $1 a pound. So cha-ching, 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 great fortunes could be made. In fact, I start one of my books with the story of James Chapman Stevenson from Wilmington, 16-year-old boy who made $50 in gold for every successful run through the blockade. He served on various blockade runners. And he said, at 16 years of age, I was making $25,000. That's the salary of President Jefferson Davis, which today would be $500,000 at 16 years of age. He would take $50 in gold, invest in a 500-pound bale of cotton that could be sold in Europe for huge amounts of money. And he was making $500,000. I'm in the wrong business. Well, anyway. And the other thing, of course, that Wilmington had was lines of communication. It did no good for ships to get into Wilmington if there were not lines of communication to get the supplies to the needy, whether it be the battlefront or the home front. And Wilmington had 3 railroads, the most important of which was the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad, which ran from Wilmington to Goldsboro to Weldon, North Carolina, where it connected to the Petersburg and Weldon Railroad. And that became the main supply route for General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And it became known as Lee's Lifeline, and then by late in the war, Lifeline of the Confederacy. When it was first completed in 1840, at 161.5 miles long, the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad was the longest railroad in the world. Isn't the history of Wilmington great? I mean, I just go on and on and on. Okay. In fact, by 1864, so important was the Wilmington and Weldon Railroad that Robert E. Lee said, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. The message was clear: the survival of the Army of Northern Virginia, the principal army for the Confederacy by 1864, and thus the survival of the Confederacy depended upon the survival of Wilmington as a blockade-running seaport. That's how important Wilmington was in our nation's history. Now, my friend Wilbur Jones has argued that it was more important during World War II. No, it was not. It was more important during the Civil War. We had a public debate on that. I won. Okay, so obviously with the growing importance of Wilmington as a blockade-running seaport, the Confederate government invested a lot of manpower and resources and money into protecting those interests. And that meant building fortifications, forts, batteries, field works at the entryway to the river, along the beach strand to provide covering fire for the blockade runners as they were attempting to get in and out of the harbor, up and down the river, and then, of course, around the city itself, because there was always the great fear, suppose Union forces in New Bern attack Wilmington overland. They just marched from New Bern 90 miles southward and attacked Wilmington from the north. Or suppose they land at Wrightsville Beach and attack by way of Bradley Creek or Hewlett's Creek. In fact, Nancy and I live at a place called Camp Davis, not to be confused with the World War II Camp Davis. The largest Confederate encampment in the lower Cape Fear was Camp Davis in our neighborhood on Greenville Sound. That's kind of an early warning system, so if Union forces landed at Wrightsville Beach, those forces would be there to slow them down until reinforcements could arrive. So these forts and batteries were absolutely crucial to the protection of Wilmington. And here's a period map, if you can see it, showing the extent, this great network of fortifications protecting Wilmington for the blockade running trade. So the forts protected the inlets that the blockade runners used. They protected the river that they went up and down. They protected the city where the supplies were offloaded and then cotton loaded onto the ships. And they protected the railroads along which the supplies were sent to the needy and the cotton was brought to town. This was absolutely the most important city in the Confederacy by late 1864. Now, I gave Joe a copy of this Confederate engineers map from 1864. Very hard to see, but I showed you that earlier map that showed the extent of the network of fortifications. But Wilmington was also guarded by fortifications. Again, for fear that the Yankees would attack Wilmington from the north and attack Wilmington where the defenses were weakest. So there was a strong line of fortifications that ran from Smith's Creek down what we call Burnt Mill Creek, which is not really Burnt Mill Creek, it's actually Green's Mill Pond, across Wrightsville Avenue, across Oleander Drive, and then right here, right where we're sitting, the lines of works ran, turned west at Battery Dawson, and went westward toward the Cape Fear River. This was a large, extensive line of fortifications. And here's a more detailed look. Wilmington only extended to 13th Street, where New Hanover High School is today. And of course, it ran along the river. Only later did it extend eastward. So here's Market Street right here. And when it got beyond 13th Street, it was called the New Bern Road or the Topsail Sound Road. But the main road was Princess Place Drive. That was the New Bern Road, not Market Street. That was not extended until the 1850s. And in red, you can see the extent of the fortifications around the city and protecting it. And here's another view. Again, I apologize for those of you in the back. You probably can't see this very well. But it's basically another Confederate engineer's map showing the extent of the fortifications in our area. And then in greater detail, I don't know if you can see it, there's Dalton Battery and the line of earthworks that run between the 9th and the 1st Fairway, and it runs to the 7th hole called McCree Battery or Battery McCree, which was named for a local doctor whose name was James F. McCree. And he was instrumental in helping Wilmingtonians, particularly during the devastating yellow fever epidemic of 1862 that killed 6.5% of the population of the town. Yellow fever was the great scourge in those days. And so Confederate military authorities thought, man, this guy was so instrumental in saving so many lives, we're going to name a Confederate artillery battery after him. Big deal. I get a mound of dirt named after me? And all of a sudden, I get a road named for me? I get a billboard name? I mean, whatever, floats your boat. Anyway, this was an honor to get an artillery battery named for you. Okay, so here's Dalton Battery, right outside the back here. There are the earthworks that run between the 18th green and the 7th green. I love that. I mean, think about that. These things are still, after 157 years, they are still here. It's absolutely amazing. I have to admit, I'm a Civil War geek. I'm an earthwork geek. I drive down the road and I'm looking for earthworks by the side of the road. And Nancy says, what are you doing? I'm looking for earthworks. Henry? They built them by hand. Henry Temple asked, how were they built? They were built by hand. So no backhoes, no bulldozers. They used slave laborers, free black laborers, and Confederate soldiers. They were all working together, and they were using shovels and wheelbarrows, and that was it. And can you imagine coming out here in 1864 and they just hand you a shovel and say, okay, boy, go to work. Start digging. Absolutely amazing. And I love that these things are still here. And most people, we tee off on the ninth tee. Well, I wish I could come out. Can I come out and play a few rounds? Okay. Please invite me to come out. I have not played out here in 40 years. I'd love to come out here and play again. So you tee off on the ninth tee, and there are the earthworks right there to your right. History is right there. Right there. That's a good question. How much have they eroded? As much as I've eroded in the 38 years that you and I have been married. Maybe more. They would have been about chest high so that a soldier could have stood on the north side and fired over the top of them with a musket. So these were sort of what you would call infantry works. Dalton Battery, McCree batteries I'm coming to, those were artillery batteries. And these are infantry curtains, they were called. And so if they were attacked, then soldiers could stand behind them with their rifle muskets and fire over the top of them. And from the outside, the only thing that you could see would be the soldier's head, but underneath them you would have a trench and a firing step so that soldiers could step down into the trench and reload these single-shot rifle muskets that Jay Talbert knows so much about. And then you step up on the banquet or the firing step and you shoot, and then you step back down and you can't be seen to be hit. They were ingeniously designed. But that's how they were built, one shovelful at a time. And in this view, you can see Battery McCree in the background. Okay? So there's Dawson Battery, there's Battery McCree, there's Wright Battery, named for James Wright, who was also the Wright family, Joshua Granger Wright. So he was a doctor too, as was John Dillard Bellamy. So these three batteries were named for doctors here in Wilmington. Imagine naming something for doctors, right? So in Battery McCree would have been one 24-pounder gun, an artillery piece that in the early days, they were designed in 1819. I'm not going to get into this too much. Construction began in 1820. The United States government manufactured more than 1,100 of these cannons, and they called them seacoast artillery. Because these cannons, at 5,800 pounds, 10 feet 4 inches long, and mounted in what was called en barbette, a French term meaning that they were put on these big giant wooden carriages to fire over the top of the artillery works. Once they're placed, they're very, very difficult to move. Unlike light artillery or field artillery that could be pulled around by caissons. Horses and mules pulled them around to battlefields. Once these were put in place, they were virtually impossible to move. And eventually they became known as siege guns. And this is a 24-pounder, meaning that it fired a projectile that was 5.68 inches in diameter, and it weighed 24 pounds. And so that's the nomenclature. The cannon weighed almost 3 tons, but the ball weighed 24 pounds. Actually, a little bit more than 24 pounds. You want me to pass this around? Yeah, get a feel for this thing. Okay, so you would have Cannoneers. It took five members of a gun crew to fire this thing. 4 Cannoneers and a gunner who was a non-commissioned officer, and he would give orders, on how to fire the gun. And they fired not only round balls like that. If they were smoothbore, if they were rifled, they would fire cylindrical shaped projectiles. The one here was a smoothbore gun. We know that because those are the projectiles we found. That came from Battery McCree. We found 5 of them. So it was a smoothbore gun, but we also found quite a bit of these canister or grape shot, and I'll pass these around too. This has been conserved so that it won't rust further. And then when it came out of the ground, it looked like that. I mean, after being in the ground for 150 plus years, you'd rust too. You'd have all kinds of bumps and pimples on you too. So I passed it around. And we have, in the last 6 months, had a conservator conserve all of these pieces. And eventually there will be a nice display in the clubhouse with the history, the Civil War history of the club. So they were fired from, called canister, if they were put into big giant tin cans. So these things would be filled with these iron balls. And when they were fired from that big giant gun, it was like a shotgun shell. So when you fired it, the canister literally just disintegrated, and then attacking infantry or cavalry had to contend with those iron balls coming their way. Or what essentially was a stand of canister, or commonly referred to as grape shot. And they looked like that. Things with a big giant iron cap and a bottom and a ring that sort of kept them all together. And we found a couple of larger balls from this stand of grape. So these are the kinds of artifacts that we found up there. Ooh, okay. Here at Battery McCree. And the fence line is right here, so that here's the old cemetery, and 16th and 17th Street would run right through here. So everybody's oriented. Okay. So from about halfway down the fairway of number 1, that's what you're looking at, that nice piece of high ground, and you can understand why they built an artillery battery there. And they were clearing it off when Joey called me back in early March last year. And we started digging. It was like digging in sugar. It's just pure white sand, no salt whatsoever. So the conservation effort has gone on very quickly. In some cases, it can take years. But in our case, with very little salt in the ground, the conservation has gone fairly quickly. No, that's a great question. The ball that's going around, where is that ball? We found 5 of those balls. That is a solid piece of iron ball. It is. It weighs 24 pounds. That would not explode. Right. That would be a solid iron ball. If you were firing at a ship, it would tear up sails, masts, spars, maybe even puncture the side of a wooden hull ship. In this case, and I hate to be graphic, but you fire those balls against attacking infantry and cavalry, because that would tear human and horses apart, absolutely tear them apart. But they also fired shells. That's a solid iron ball, but they also fired shells, meaning that there was a cavity on the inside that was filled with gunpowder and a hole where you put a time fuse on it. And you fired it and you punched it, or it was a wooden fuse or paper fuse that was timed to go off in, say, 2 seconds. The firing of these things was slow enough you could actually see the balls coming towards you. And that projectile weighed 17 pounds because, of course, it was hollow. Now, once you filled it up with gunpowder, it weighed approximately 24 pounds. And that, once the fuse detonated, the ball exploded. And then you had to contend with fragments of balls like that, right? So it was a great question. Solid iron balls and shells. We found no shells up there. And of course, where was the cannon? What happened to the cannon? And what happened to the cannons in all the works? I think they were probably taken by the Yankees for fear that those rebels were going to do it all again after the war. Actually, I think they were probably taken and busted up for scrap drives during World War I and World War II. If you look at early photographs of downtown Wilmington, what do you see at the intersections of the roads? Old cannons. So that horse and buggies and then automobiles would not cut across the corners of the road. And 3 years ago, March of 2017, when they were doing work along Water Street, which they're doing now, they uncovered an early 18th century cannon, 1715 to 1730, that we're going to have conserved and remounted at Riverfront Park. But that predated the American Revolution. Why was that there? I mean, it was in perfect shape. Why would they bury a cannon underneath Water Street? I have my theories, but there were cannons everywhere to protect Wilmington during the Revolutionary War, during the Civil War, and during World War II, like at Fort Castle. Okay, so that's a great question. So Chris Bird's friend Gil Fagan from Laura, South Carolina came up with his metal detector. I had my metal detector. We didn't have time to do a proper archaeological excavation where you dig pits and you take measurements, all that. This was purely salvage archaeology because of the time constraints. Unfortunately, we were unable to get up on top of the battery. I can imagine, next time you play and you're putting on the 7th green, imagine all the history that's underneath you. There's still a lot of artifacts underneath that green. And Joey said, man, if you'd been here 2 weeks earlier, we could have hunted the top of the green. But they'd already put in the sod and the gravel, and we couldn't hunt that. So we had to hunt the west and southern slope of the green. And Gil came up with one time and hunted with me. He actually came up before I did. And then I spent most of March and April. I was out here, gosh, every day for 8 hours a day. I mean, I was like a kid in a candy store. I was just having a great time. And Joey said, well, can we pay you anything? I said, are you kidding? I want to pay you. I'm having so much fun. And so I dug. And in fact, in this case, as you can see, we actually got the course designer, Andrew, to take down about 4 feet of dirt because we were finding stuff as deep as our metal detectors would read. And we took off about 4 feet of dirt. And guess what? We were finding more stuff. So there's more stuff there. We just couldn't, we didn't have the time, and our technology was limited that we couldn't get to it. And so here's some photographs that I took of the excavations as I was doing them. This is a hole that's about 18 inches deep, and you can see that I have dug grape shot, and I've given you perspective with it. I was using long-handled shovel and a folding Ames World War II shovel. And again, most of what we found were these canister balls. I'm glad you asked that question because I'm coming to that. We also found a few mini balls, which are lead rifle musket projectiles that weigh 1 ounce. They're called mini balls because a Frenchman named Minet, and it's gotten southernized over the years, mini balls. Smoothbore muskets fired round musket balls, like during the Revolutionary War. But eventually, they came up with rifled, actually rifles go back to the 18th century, but they were new technology, they were way too expensive, but by the middle of the 19th century, that was the standard firearm, single shot rifle musket. They had repeating rifles, Henry rifles and Spencers, but they were too expensive. So the single shot rifle musket that fired a 1 ounce lead mini ball was the standard firearm on both sides. And we found a few of those. I was actually surprised that we didn't find more. And we also found these cannon friction primers that are little pieces of brass about 3 inches high, and they're filled with fulminate of mercury. And at the end would be a twisted or braided wire. And when attached to a lanyard, when you pulled the braid out, it created a spark that went down the tube of that friction primer into the breech of a cannon or the back end of a cannon and detonated gunpowder that had been pushed in bags all the way to the bottom. And when the gunpowder exploded, then it pushed out one of those 24-pounder balls or those stands of grape or canister. So there's one of the 24-pounder balls as I dug it. I don't know if you can see the hole there, the way that they came out of the ground, almost like they were made yesterday. They were actually in pretty good shape, but they've been conserved and are in really nice shape now. All right, this is how deep one of those balls was. Can you see that? I'm standing in a hole waist deep. It's a good looking digger there, right? Not bad for a 66-year-old guy. Anyway, I am standing waist deep, and that's how deep that ball was. So what's that? I'm 5'11", so that's almost 3 feet. It's about 3 feet deep. Are there other balls deeper than that I just couldn't read? I don't know. And we'll never know at this point. But I had to take a selfie of me standing in that hole. And you should have seen me trying to get the ball out of the hole. You couldn't just put a shovel underneath it and jerk it out like that. And I had to get down, I had to make the hole big enough that I could squat down, roll the ball up onto my toes, and then roll it up my legs. I'm glad nobody was there to film this thing. I really did look like a nerd. And then get it up out of the hole. And in this case, it took me about 45 minutes to dig that hole and get that ball out of the hole. And I was so impressed with myself. I got to make a selfie of this. This is pretty cool. But I also wanted to give you all an idea of how deep these projectiles were. Stuart?
Has anybody ever identified a central magazine for that battery where there might be a lot of shells?
That's a great question, because close by there would have been a magazine where there would have been gunpowder. So at each of these batteries there would have been projectiles, but you've got to have gunpowder to fire the projectiles. And believe it or not, there was a magazine at Battery Right, which is the next battery down between 16th and 17th Street. But of course they built that cemetery in there. That's on my list of things to try and find. It's on the map, but is it still there? My guess is that buried deep but underneath the ground between 16th and 17th Street is a load of gunpowder. Wouldn't the city love to know about that? But Stuart, that's the closest battery or magazine that I know of. Great question. Okay, were these batteries ever attacked? Fort Fisher is commemorating the 155th anniversary of the Second Battle of Fort Fisher this weekend. I'm speaking twice. Y'all come on down. These were the two largest naval bombardments of the Civil War. The January battle, and yesterday was the 155th anniversary of the fall of Fort Fisher, was the largest amphibious operation in American military history until D-Day World War II. Y'all know that? The largest naval armadas assembled in modern history up to that time attacked Fort Fisher. It took them 2 attacks, took them Yankees 2 times before they finally got us. And Fort Fisher fell, and then blockade running was closed to Wilmington. And as Lee predicted, if Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. After capturing Fort Fisher, closing the harbor to blockade running, Union forces then turned their gun sights on Wilmington, advanced up both sides of the Cape Fear River, an armada of flotilla of gunboats on the river itself, advanced on the city and captured it on George Washington's birthday, 1865. And the fall of Wilmington was the Confederacy's last hope. When I wrote my first book, authors are always looking for a great title for their PowerPoint show, Battering on the Green. And I ran across a letter by Bill Calder's great-great-grandfather, William Calder, from Wilmington. And he wrote that as they were leaving Wilmington, trudging through the darkened streets in the pre-dawn hours of February 22nd, heading into the interior states to join forces with other Confederates who were retreating into North Carolina in front of General Sherman's army, pushing through South Carolina, William Calder wrote, "We could see a few lights shining from residences, and they appeared to us to be the last rays of departing hope." And I thought that was so symbolic. It was the last rays of departing hope for the Confederacy. And within 42 days after the fall of Wilmington, Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to U.S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, and the war ended. And that's how important Wilmington was. And that's the role that Cape Fear Country Club played in that struggle. It's just a great, great history. And by the way, when I was researching battering McCree, I ran across a newspaper article from 1906. Now, Bill's great-great-grandfather, William, and he's named for his great-great-grandfather, fought for the Confederacy. He was in the 1st North Carolina Battalion of Heavy Artillery. His grandfather, Robert Calder, in 1906, and he was a Civil War geek like me, Bill. He and Mr. Bridgers, was it Robert Bridgers? Robert Bridgers? Clark. Burke. Okay, Burke. He and Burke Bridgers walked the entire line of existing Confederate defenses. What's that? 41 years after the war's end. From Smith's Creek down Burnt Mill Creek. So from Oakdale Cemetery through Wallace Park, all the way across Riceville Avenue, across Oleander Drive, into what will become Cape Fear Country Club, to Dalton Battery, turned west, and walked all the way to the Cape Fear River, exploring those earthworks that were still there in 1906. And I mentioned that to Bill when I found the newspaper article about that quest. He said, "Mr. Bridgers lived right next to us at Riceville Beach. I used to surf fish with him. I never knew this." And I'm like, man, if I had known that, I would have been down there with y'all surf fishing every day asking Mr. Bridgers, tell me about those earthworks. The batteries were still there. Were the guns still there? Were the cannonballs still in the batteries? It wasn't that long ago. It really wasn't that long ago. And I love it. And I love my wife of 38 years. Who is spending her anniversary listening to me tell y'all about cannonballs and mini balls. God bless her. Thank you very much. Did I get that done in an hour? Perfect. Boom. Does anybody have any questions, comments, observations, hallucinations? Anybody? Yes, sir. Well, I'm glad you asked that because this line was never attacked. The outer city defenses that the Confederate military authorities thought would be necessary to keep the Yankees from attacking by way of New Bern, that never happened. The Federals actually blew it. They could have captured Wilmington earlier had they been more aggressive. In fact, one Union naval admiral wrote in his Civil War memoirs, had the Union captured Wilmington in 1862 or even 1863, the war would have ended at least a year earlier. And they did not. This line was never attacked. However, When the Union attacked Wilmington, up what was called the Confederate Point Road, earlier the Federal Point Road, what we would call Carolina Beach Road, which did not open until 1940. The advance led them through the grounds of the Cameron Art Museum. And the Confederates had built another line of field works, not as strong or as big as these works, but another line of works a little bit further out. And so there was a battle at the Cameron Art Museum, or what locals refer to as the Battle of Jumping Run, because between here and there is Jumping Run Creek that feeds into Greenfield Lake. And so the first time I was taken out there by old Doc Treadwell, do y'all remember him, the veterinarian? He called this the Battle of Jumping Run. And so it's the proximity of that battlefield to Jumping Run Creek. But these lines were abandoned before they were attacked. Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Bobby? About 2 miles. About 2 miles. Yeah. And what the Confederates would have done is they used the cypress swamps as part of the defenses. You would build your works up to the ponds and creeks and use them as sort of moats as part of the natural defenses. But they also cleared out the woods or thinned out the woods for about 600 yards south of the works for a military jargon field of fire, so that any enemy forces that approached within 600 yards, the Confederates could see to fire on them. And those cannons at 600 yards were deadly accurate. They could fire up to 2 miles. And I don't know if you all remember the artillery piece that I showed you as among those that the Confederacy imported. It was a Whitworth, 12-pounder Whitworth rifle cannon made by Joseph Whitworth in Great Britain. Those things could shoot a fly off a post 6 miles away. So we think, well, 150 years ago, I mean, yeah, that's pretty crude, right? No, they were brilliant technicians at building artillery. And rifle muskets, Jay can tell you, they could hit a target at easily 350 to 500 yards away. And a Whitworth sharpshooting rifle, you could hit a person 1,000 yards away. So these were very, very accurate weapons.
Wasn't there a cannon off from West Point down to Fort Fisher?
I think, yes. The most famous piece of seacoast artillery at Fort Fisher was an 8-inch, 150-pounder Armstrong rifle cannon. The cannon tube itself weighed 6,000 pounds. It fired a projectile that was 8 inches in diameter and weighed 150 pounds. There were 2 of those weapons made by W.G. Armstrong and Company in England that were imported through the blockade into Wilmington in August of 1864 on a blockade runner called the Hope. And the commanding general here, William Henry Chase Whiting, was so impressed with the size of these things, he said, look, I've got to have these cannons here. So he implored the Ordnance Department in Richmond, can you buy these cannons? I'd like to put them at Wilmington. And they put one at Fort Fisher and one at Fort Caswell. And when Fort Fisher and Fort Caswell were captured, the Army took the Armstrong gun from Fort Fisher and took it to where? West Point. At Trophy Point, overlooking the Hudson River. The largest collection in public that I know of, at least, of U.S. or of artillery that was captured during wars, from the colonial wars all the way through the Middle Eastern wars going on now. There are hundreds of pieces of artillery, and the centerpiece of that collection at Trophy Point is Fort Fisher's Armstrong rifle cannon. And in 2006, Fort Fisher was actually able to borrow it for 16 months. And the Army fought that. They did not want Fort Fisher to have it for any length of time, but Jesse Helms intervened. He was senator, yes. And they brought that cannon back for 16 months. And to tell you how the federal government worked, they said, okay, we'll let you borrow it, but you've got to build a concrete pad. You've got to build a carriage for that gun to sit on. We want you to build a security fence with motion sensors. Fort Fisher spent $75,000 to bring that cannon to Fort Fisher for 16 months. And my question was, who the hell's going to steal a 6,000-pound cannon under any circumstances, much less break through a fence with motion sensors? So some redneck is going to drive down to Fort Fisher on a Saturday night and throw that thing up on the back of his pickup truck and drive away? And you wonder why we're $23 trillion in debt. That's a perfect example. Yes, sir. Yes. That's absolutely true. It's called Moore's Battery. And next time you go along Market Street, you get to 23rd Street, say you're going downtown. You get to 23rd Street, what do? You dip down, right? And then you go back up at about 20th Street. That was a flooded mill pond called Green's Mill Pond. That is not Burnt Mill Creek. Burnt Mill Creek, the real Burnt Mill Creek, is on the west and north side of Oakdale Cemetery. So when you go into the old section of Oakdale Cemetery, my family's buried in there, and I know many of your families are buried in there. 1/4 of me will be buried in there one day. The other 3/4 will be blown out of 3 different cannons. I'm serious. I told Nancy, blow me out of cannon. I mean, what a better way to go? But I don't want to go out with a bang. I want to go out with a bang, bang, bang. But anyway, the creek on the west and north side is Burnt Mill Creek that flows into what we call Burnt Mill Creek today, but it's really Greens Mill Pond Channel. And as you go west on Market Street and you go down the dip, you cross the creek and you go up, look at the National Cemetery, and you can actually see the tiers of the old Moore's Battery. And Union soldiers, both black and white, who were killed during the Wilmington campaign and at Fort Fisher, starting with them, they were buried there. So the Union took control of that area, which was an old farm, and in 1865 they buried their dead there, and in 1867 it was incorporated as a national cemetery, and it's one of 5 national cemeteries in North Carolina. But you can still see the tiers of old Moore's Battery. Anybody else? Well, I've loved being with y'all tonight. Thank you very much for coming. It's been great. And I hope to see you out on the golf course. Thank you. That was that.
Appreciate it.
Is that what you wanted?
Absolutely. Really appreciate it.
That was great.
I'm one of the few people here that do
Oh, Dr. Reynolds. I am so glad to see you.
that's my father.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, Fairfax. Yeah. Fairfax and I went to school together. Her dad's passed away. He was my pediatrician. How about that? How about that? God bless you. That was probably my Uncle Alex family. My dad was Gene.
I know. I know.
Catherine's my sister.
The hard doctor.
On the first hole in 1960 when he was playing with Bunny Hines in the Irish Train. And he survived that heart attack and then died exactly 10 years after that. He was only 48 years old.
Got to it. I do. I am in Laura Farm.
is my first cousin. Her dad and Margaret's dad was Alec. Alec was probably right.